Twinning.
Let me put a hoodie on.
No, we can't look the same. That's fine.
I think it's one of our best sellers on our Ray Gun merch shop.
You should go on our Ray Gun merch shop and check it out so you can look just like us too. In fact, if you own this shirt, you should go wear it while you're watching this video so you can feel like you're part of the club.
Pause the video, go put on your Dismantle Oppressive System shirt, and then click play.
What are we talking about today, Nick?
Talking about millennials. So I'm an elder millennial myself. I'm 37 years old. In the media back in the day, right? I think for the media, millennials are perpetual teenagers, and so they always treated us like this. This was a Time magazine cover that came out in 2013. I was 27 years old in 2013, and this Time magazine cover characterizes millennials as the me generation, calling us lazy,
The meme
entitled
generation.
yeah, who still live with their parents and then, of course, flipping it on their heads while they'll save us all. And, it was really the rise of social media. And so I can recall just being unfavorably characterized, stereotyped, all the cliches that kind of come with intergenerational comparisons, So there's always this stereotype that the younger generations are lazy, entitled, they only care about themselves or their or technology or video games or kind of
Right.
whatever.
And it dates back generations, like what jacks on the street or whatever. Like
Yeah,
kids are
exactly.
always the problem, no matter how old you are.
Yes. And I think what we have seen then, Zoomers and Gen Z, is a lot of the same. And I think until recently, there just has not been a lot of actual survey data about Gen Z. Chris, do you have the dates for when Zoomers are born so we can kind of talk about what generation that?
I mean, it varies survey to survey, but the one that we're looking at finds Gen Z as born between 1997 and 2011.
Okay. So these are almost all of the students that I had ever taught, right? Since I had
Same.
taught high school. Yeah, same for you. So we taught Gen Z, really, for the most part, a generation that grew up. I feel like the dividing line would be like post 9/11. 1997 even seems a little earlier, or maybe that's a Gen Alpha coming up there, the post 9/11 generation. But what we're going to look at today is this huge release of survey data from Gallup. Why this is so insightful is because without the words themselves and the responses themselves, of course, it's maybe self-reported survey data, but without that, we're just left with speculation and, of course, intergenerational stereotypes about younger generations as lazier, as less skilled, as whatever.
I guess starting off, less than half, 47% of Gen Z Americans are thriving in their lives. The minority believe that they are thriving in their lives, among the lowest across all generations in the US today, at a much lower rate than millennials were at the same age when they were still doing this report. 76% of Gen Z members agree they have a great future ahead of them, yet only 44% report feeling prepared for their future. So interesting dichotomy there. Members of Gen Z who have an adult encouraging them to pursue their goals and dreams are more than twice as likely as those without to strongly agree they have a great future ahead, 51% versus 23%. Despite significant learning loss coming out of the pandemic, kind of big asterisk there for our take on that, but 3/4 of Gen Z students rate their academic performance as excellent or good, though male, Black, and Hispanic students rate their academic performance lower than others. Gen Z students with excellent mental health are more than twice as likely as those with fair or poor mental health to say that they get excellent grades in school, 53 versus 25%, and are 24 points less likely to have missed any school in the past month. And then finally, Gen Z's most frequently cited hope for the future is to make enough money to live comfortably, 69%, while 64% say financial resources are a barrier to achieving their future goals and aspirations.
So just on the face of it, if you go back up to those first couple of points, the contradictions, and I don't say that in a negative way, but just maybe the tensions between how they view themselves in the present compared to the future, how they view themselves, again, in relationship to the future. But the vast majority say that they have a great future ahead of them while also feeling unprepared for it. For number 6, most frequently cited hope is to make enough money to live comfortably, but financial resources are a barrier to achieving that. There's a really interesting insight into the precarity and economic scarcity that we kind of face today. They want to be able to live thriving and financially prosperous lives, but those aren't necessarily the ones that they see for themselves now. And of course, we know with the cost of college and the cost of higher education, there are bigger barriers to entry for, say, the jobs and the futures that they see themselves.
Right. I mean, we're at the time of the highest amounts of inequity, I'm pretty sure, since the Gilded Age, right? I
Right.
mean, this has been described as the second Gilded Age that we're living through. Americans were the least optimistic that they have been the last 3 decades about young
Wow.
people's chances of having a better future.
Wow. So this might be a snapshot of where people are at now in their
This is a
lives.
snapshot of where people are now because it says, we asked them to rate their current and future lives on a scale of 0 to 10.
Oh no.
Um,
The 80 plus crowd is like my future life. Uh
yeah, I mean,
feeling great about
that's
that.
kind of dark.
It's really kind of shocking how much it declines as you get older and then younger. I would not have imagined that you and I, Chris, would be like at the peak of this thriving life evaluation part,
Well, it is worth
in our mid
noting,
30s.
though, that this also, if you just take this to like a 50,000-foot level and don't focus on the politics of it or the like what's in the news reports, etc., this is also the age at which you have the most like healthy life typically. Like millennials are in the age range where they are just starting their families, maybe they have a couple kids, they perhaps are at a position that they feel like they're going to stay at. um Gen Z are still figuring things out. Gen X might be starting to wean off. Maybe they're, maybe they're divorced, maybe they had a tragedy happen, etc. Baby boomers are getting up there in age. Silent generation on their way out. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
I feel like this just mirrors probably the trajectory of thriving in life just from a biological perspective in 2023, let alone the
That's a
politics.
really good point. I think too, there might also just be thinking of boomers and the silent generation, like my parents are boomers, one of them is retired. And I think, increasingly retirement is either becoming more expensive or out of reach for a lot of people. So perhaps some of those stress and that risk, that worry about thriving really is about like, oh, am I going to have enough money to be able to retire, or just straight up like I can't.
We're also Americans too, and
Yeah.
we tend to be less happy when we're not working. Although
Oh,
there are certainly people that thrive when they're retired, Americans have a very unique perspective on work that makes us more likely to be happy while we're working. It is worth noting they bring up on here that it's not just because of stage of life, because they say when millennials were the same age as Gen Z, millennials were thriving more. It says Gallup measured 59 and 60% of millennials thriving respectively. And in 2023, only 41% of Gen Z adults are thriving, aka the rate of thrivingness from generation to generation has gone down.
but I can remember being an 18-year-old. It was like the early 2000s. And, it was post 9/11. It was like 2004, 2005. And that was really pre Great Recession. So I think 18 to 26-year-old millennials back in the early 2000s probably were in a good spot. But it really was after 2008, I think, that, with the financial collapse, the worst recession since the Great Depression, that things really took a hit for millennials. And that would have been I would have been in my mid 20s by then.
And this one just shows then they did kind of a cross analysis for Gen Z as
Huh.
they graduate high school. And you can see that the percent of people that are reporting to be thriving in Gen Z that are in high school are about halfway, about 50-50. Those who did not go to college or are currently enrolled in college are tied for being
Oh,
quite
wow.
low, 38%. And then those who have graduated college are back up to where they were prior. I would imagine that some of this deals with income,
Yeah.
considering that this no post-secondary education could also correlate with those who perhaps can't afford to go to college as opposed to those that want to or who don't
Yeah.
want to. But also, like, 52% still a very low number. I think there's an issue with reducing people down to statistics and looking at percentages in the sense that That means that 48% are not thriving even with the post-secondary degree. That's a lot of
Yeah.
people.
This lady with her, she needs to be
Yeah.
our thumbnail.
Continuing on with just reading stats off a screen, uh, how would you describe your own mental health or emotional well-being at this
Yeah.
time? Overwhelmingly, still is excellent or good, but as you increase age level, for the most part, mental health is getting better. Gen Z on a daily basis is distinct from other generations because Gen Z report having experienced negative emotions such as stress, anxiety, and loneliness a lot of the prior day. This incidence of negative emotions is particularly high among Gen Z, which reports rates of anxiety, stress, sadness, and loneliness at least 7 percentage points higher than those of millennials, Gen Z, or Gen X, baby boomers, and the silent generation. That can be attributed to a variety of things. I think often the media, or I guess zeitgeist, focuses on social media, which is partially causing mental health problems, but it's also school, the state of the world, etc.
I wonder the extent to which social media just amplifies a lot of the awareness about structural systemic issues. When I
Right.
was in high school, I did not have the awareness of a lot of things that the students that I had who were Gen Zers had a ton of awareness about because of social media.
But like there's no doubt that cynicism and apathy can be a result of learning about how dark the world truly is, as opposed to just assuming everything's okay and then just going about your life and having the privilege to be able to ignore that. This is an interesting thing though. When you first linked this to me, this is the first thing that really stood out. Generally, people in Gen Z are hyper optimistic. It says that 82% believe that they will achieve their goals,
Yeah.
76% believe they have a great future ahead of them, and 66% feel they can obtain their dream job.
I love the header there at the top of that last bit. Gen Z optimism in the face of struggling mental and emotional health. So again,
Mhm.
there's like that tension and that contradiction almost in those two things. It's like, hey, I feel good about the future, but right now I'm struggling, man. Like
Yeah.
there's something to be said about that.
Specifically, Black Gen Z members are the most optimistic. You can
Yeah.
see here they're comparing Black,
Wow.
Hispanic, and white Gen Zers. And Black Gen Zers are much more likely to be optimistic
Wow.
and feel like they're
Wow. Wow.
going to get
Wow.
a good job in the future. That's a really interesting breakdown. And Gallup says, and Gallup just kind of actually doesn't say much about that. They just highlight that. But there's some interesting reporting that I'll bring up here in a second. A few more stats, and then we'll start breaking this thing down. Having a mentor makes a huge difference.
Okay.
When someone says, there's an adult at my school, or I have someone who encourages me to pursue my goals and dreams, if they feel that way, then they're much more likely to feel like they have a great future ahead of them. In fact, they're double as
Oh,
likely, which I think says something about the implications of school.
yeah.
Having, talking about purpose finding, talking about people doing that work, which, brief segue, that's part of our professional development process.
So what we do is we sit down and we do focus groups of a cross section of students, depending on what ages and grade levels the school district wants to look at, and we ask them those questions about their aspirations for the future, their hopes and dreams. How do the practices and of school support that or not? What changes would they like to see made in there? And really even just having that connection and being able to have some say in their environment really helps students feel connected to the space and know that the adults are being responsive to their needs and their input. That's kind of a big deal. What we kind of think is, well, let's start by making schools happier, healthier, more sustainable spaces, just like this mentorship in the Gallup survey seems to promote here. And then the learning objectives will follow. That's what this data seems to bear out, is that, hey, if you have connections to school community, if you have connections to adult mentors, you're going to feel like you have a purpose. You're going to feel like you have a connection to a better, thriving future. And kids who are left out of that feel like they don't.
The dichotomy here, which this is getting into that cognitive dissonance that we saw at the beginning. Although the optimism is high, only 44% of Gen Zs feel prepared for the future. Less than half. In fact, those that are 19 to 21, aka college bound kids, the kids that are in college, are the least that feel prepared at 38%. Nearly 7 in 10 Gen Z members enrolled in middle and high school say their schools exposed them to different career paths, and about half say they learned skills in school relevant to the job that they want. However, schools are falling short in providing practical learning opportunities that will help young Americans secure a good job after high school. You can see these stats here. 34% say their school offers opportunities to learn how to apply for a job. 33% say their schools offers opportunities to work on projects relevant to the job they want. And 29% say their school offers help on how to interview for a job. And I think back to when I was teaching, and I was fortunate. I taught a career technical class, so I mean, I kind of had this embedded in the curriculum. But typically, what most kids were, I guess, subjected to were those career relevance surveys. Did you ever have to do those in Iowa?
Yeah.
They answer a series of way too many questions, like 100 to 200 questions, and they're all like really ridiculous. And eventually it tells them, this is the job that you're best suited for. I don't have any data to support this, but I genuinely think that those things are pointless. I don't
Yeah.
know any person ever who has completed one of those surveys and then gone, oh, I guess I know what I want to do now.
Kids are not going to get a sense of what they want to do in the future from taking a survey or, doing that. They're
Yeah.
going to see the people in their lives and the things that they do, so they'll say like, oh, my mom is a nurse. My dad is a insurance adjuster.
And importantly too, you can't go in there with economic reasoning solely in mind. The number of people who are entering college thinking, oh, I'm going to become an accountant because accountants make a lot of money, and then graduate and can't get a job because either they're not passionate about it, those job opportunities don't exist, there's too much competition for them.
The idea that you go to high school, you go to college, you get a job, and you work that job until you retire is gone. That is not, that will set you up for failure, for midlife crisis, that will set you
Right.
up for the unhappinesses that exist in the boomer generation. I think just opening the possibility to say that, your life is out there for you to make, and there's a lot of opportunities to change tracks at any time for whatever reason you really feel like, and that's okay. It's not a linear path. It's not a linear progression towards some common end goal. We're all figuring this out together all the time.
Changing course here, but I think this part stands out to me because it talks about learning loss. And we have a whole video podcast write-ups. We have a whole resource on learning loss. And our take in one sentence is that learning loss, as the collective understand it, isn't real. In the sense that learning loss really constitutes one or two questions on a test in the face of a global pandemic that killed tens to hundreds of thousands of people. The idea of this learning loss at large is really not that big of a deal considering everything that's going on. And it's interesting because Gallup finds that, in their words, they say students are likely underestimating the state of their academic achievement, with 74% of Gen Z middle and high schoolers describing their grades as excellent or good. And they say that, like, despite the fact there's significant learning loss. I would argue that one or two questions on the test has nothing to do with your grade, right? You could have great grades and still be participating in school during the COVID-19 pandemic. To be cynical about it, your grades were actually likely higher because people weren't grading as rigorously during the pandemic. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
I think that bears out.
and check this out too. So they surveyed kids about school generally in Gen Z. And it's interesting what's focused on and what people are agreeing on versus what they're not agreeing with at all. So what stands out here at the top are, you have a best friend at school. That's great. In the last 7 days, someone has told me I've done good work, so I've gotten praised, and I feel motivated to get good grades. And that someone cares about me. Still a relatively high number. The adults at school care, but the overall focus is on grades, praise, almost extrinsic motivators. But then when you get down to the bottom here, at school, I get to do what I do best every day is a very low number. 9% strongly agree with that. 31% agree. So a total of 40%. Or my schoolwork challenges me in a good way is still like nearly a 50%. Or my teachers make me feel my schoolwork is important, still relatively low. 60%, I guess, is still a majority. The difference between the extrinsic motivators here at the top of grades and praise versus the intrinsic motivators of like, it matters and it challenges me and I get to do what I like to do is very interesting.
Okay. Relationship Between Gen Z engagement in school and positive outlook.
So basically, the more you feel connected to the things that you're doing at school, the more likely you're going to say that you have a great future ahead of yourself, that you're going to have a purposeful and meaningful life. It's common sense, but it is good promotion for why you should focus more on purpose finding in school. And
Doesn't that
like
support what we
intrinsic
were
motivation.
just talking about? Like our
Yeah,
central thesis as an organization, which is if you
yeah,
focus on the connection, the sustainability, the health, and purpose part, then the learning outcomes will follow. Isn't that what this is saying? That
yeah.
the
I mean, isn't
more
this
that
common
kids
sense?
feel,
Like if you put a bunch of kids into a room and drill and kill them, like when we were investigating what was going on in Houston ISD, where he was putting a bunch of kids into a room and saying, "Do
yeah,
worksheets, and everything will work out." They're going to
yeah.
be much less likely to feel purposeful in their work, and therefore they're going to burn out and not pursue more interesting, meaningful tasks for themselves, which in general is going to make a much worse future for everyone involved. You're going to have individuals that are less happy, but at a society level, if you have a bunch of people who are not happy with what they're doing and don't feel purposeful, you'll have less innovation, less cool things that happen, less community, because less people will be involved.
In spite of this, there will still be school systems that will say that no, other stuff is more important.
Mhm.
And that is the interesting thing, right? Where, you know,
Cut the
we
fluff and teach the
developed
stuff.
we
Yeah.
developed yeah, exactly, we developed the structures and systems of school before we knew the impact that all of it was going to have, on kids. Now we have the data, we have the science, we have the research, we have the input from kids themselves, and it reiterates what we've been saying about the role of purpose, of health, and well-being.
It goes into the fact that students with excellent mental health are more than twice as likely as those with fair or poor mental health to say that they get excellent grades in school, because it only makes sense that if you don't have great mental health, you're not going to get as good of grades. And although grades also are kind of problematic in how they work, and we kind of advocate for moving away from those, it makes sense to say that if you focus on making kids happier and healthier, they're going to get higher grades. There is an interesting side note here. It's not just school, right? This is all
Yes.
happening at a societal, systemic level, and there's a lot of other things going on. A very uniquely American thing is obviously gun violence. This has an
Yeah.
interesting report here that 40% of Gen Z students report worrying a lot or some about gun violence at their school. Actually, a lower number than I would expect. I will say, as a teacher, I wonder if they ever have done a teacher statistic of this, but I would bet it's the vast majority or close to it of teachers are worried about gun violence at their school. Maybe because we get training on it, so we're more focused on it. But
This is from a 2022 report from Kraft and Lyon, researchers out of Brown University. It's actually about actually the rise and fall of the teaching profession, but I think it actually bolsters the gun violence data, the fears that Gen Zers have about gun violence, because right, that graph skyrocketing over there on the y-axis is the number of school shootings, and here you can see there was a little bit of a blip in 2020 and then just boom. At the same time, in 2021, guns actually surpassed cars, cancer, suffocation, and drug overdoses as the leading cause of death for kids.
even back in 1980, 1970, these numbers are still so high. I mean,
Yeah.
25 school shootings per year is a lot if you
Yeah.
compare that to practically any other country where their
Literally.
line would be like not even you wouldn't be able to see a jump on the graph because it would be so
Yes.
low, because most countries are at 0 or less than 5, right?
Yeah.
Like this is not normal. They do dive into like what are the greatest hopes and aspirations. I'll just put it up on the screen. I don't want to spend too much time on there, but it's basically making enough money to live comfortably, getting married or finding a life partner, and pursuing passion in your work and buying a house. Interestingly enough, I would say that the at least two of these are things that millennials probably are very much struggling with. Arguably three, if you count the divorce rate. But making enough money to find to live a life comfortably and to buy a house are things that are out of reach for um, sadly too many people. And then finally, what best describes what you would like to do in the future? Number one
Oh,
thing is
okay.
get a paid job,
Okay.
get to travel, get
Less
a
than
graduate
half. All
degree.
right.
Probably important. But typical things: travel, get a degree, start a business. They want to accomplish things. The barriers that they have to achieving those goals and aspirations are basically financial. You can see here, like, it's overwhelmingly related to financial or funding options. So again,
Mm,
there's this separation between the reality of there are various systems in the United States that are and abroad, the result of neoliberal policies that are
a
causing people to not have the financial opportunity to do a lot of these things, along with climate change and various other things that are related, versus the optimism that people are feeling. Now, I did want to pull in some other things because I think it's important to see this in context with how the America has spoken about future living conditions and optimism more broadly. So this is a chart from 2018. This is from Ipsos, which Ipsos is like a statistics magazine. They were kind of like Gallup. You can see from 2018, the United States consistently ranks one of the highest developed countries in terms of believing in future optimism. So in 2018, 61% of youth felt like there would be better future living conditions, 47% of adults. But like, compare that to France, the UK, or Germany, which are much lower, 42%, 41%, 35%, or to developing countries like Kenya and Brazil. That Kenya's at 95% feel that future living conditions will be better.
oh
I,
God,
I don't
this looks very
want to spend
academic.
too much time on this because this is a very like advanced report. Basically, what this says, and people I guess can read it on their own to dive into it further. So consistently, the United States ranked as more optimistic about their futures over decades upon decades upon decades. Like, this is a report from over 100 years, and Americans in general are almost always optimistic about the future versus those in other countries. Let me find this. There's a graph in here that's really interesting. So they're comparing this to other comparable European countries. And specifically, they're talking about this idea of the American dream slash this idea of like social mobility. Typically, when people are asked the question, is the future better? They're referring to, are you going to do better than your parents economically? Like, have a nicer house,
Right.
live in a better conditions, etc. And you can see that this chart's a little hard to read, but the US here on the left are the share of people
Oh,
saying
okay.
yes to these questions here on the left. So on this chart here on the left, the US consistently across every single one of these questions is pretty much beating out every other comparable European country. The economic system's fair, the American dream's alive.
Effort is the reason you are poor
Yeah.
and
Um,
rich. Okay.
but then notice here on the right, those who tend to be right wing or more conservative answer these questions almost entirely yes versus those on the left. And the reason this paper argues that this is the case, and the reason why Americans are more likely to be optimistic about their future, is that people in the US tend to be more individualistic than other societies because of how we think about like social Darwinism, the Horatio Alger stories, the way at which Americans compete versus others, versus the more collective nature of other similarly economically focused but different culturally European countries. So people on that lean more left wing, or people in European countries that lean more left wing, are less optimistic about the future because they see more of the collective.
Yeah. Well, of course. I mean, if you are more aligned with the predominant political and economic ideology of the system that you live in, you're going to agree with its aims and its ends more often. Now, you're getting too far away from the graph. I wanted to point out something on
Oh,
here,
okay.
but I think it is kind of hilarious that it looks like 100% of France says yes, that they have a negative view of government. Is that how I can read that?
I think so. Just an interesting side note about the specific Black American perspective about hope for the future. There's another report, similarly academic in scope to this one, that talks about that and contribute that to the fact that white Americans feel pressured by, I guess, like forces that are telling them that they're privileged, or that it's like they're racist or inherently racist. Like that whole argument of like, you're making me feel bad because you're telling me about the truth.
Yeah, it is interesting. Like grievance only gets it doesn't grievance doesn't chart a path forward. That's not a tool that you can use to have hope in the future. Grievance and particularly, like right-wing politics is necessarily backwards looking, right? It looks at what you've lost. It looks at, your gains have to come at someone else's expense.
So this is the summary of the article here from the Brookings Institute. And it says, in contrast, Black and Hispanic people are more likely to report their lives are better than their parents' lives. While disadvantage and discrimination still exist, minorities have been making gradual progress and narrowing gaps with white people in terms of their education, wages, and life expectancy. Some of this is because of concrete gains made by those communities, but much of the improvement is due to the relative decline in the incomes and status of poor white people, a trend associated with the hollowing out of blue-collar jobs, which are decreasing in both number and stability. So it's kind of happening on two counts. One is we are a less racist society, right? I mean, even though structural racism still exists, there's no denying that as you move further and further down generation levels, people are more accepting, which is a great thing. That's one of the things that gives me hope about the future, is that people are more accepting on race, sexual identity, whatever it might be. But at the exact same time, white people are actually feeling like they're losing something. Part of this is also due to the fact that Black and Hispanic people are less likely than white people to report depression or commit suicide. And they say that some of this may be due to resilience built up over generations of hardship, as seen in many poor countries. Informal safety nets also play a role, such as communities surrounding Black churches and extended Hispanic families. So again, obviously, no one's a monolith in their culture, but certainly the fact that there's been historic structural racism against Black and Hispanic people is going to lead you to be more focused on a collective commitment to doing better together, as opposed to the situation that's happening in white neighborhoods where there was this privilege, right? There's a privilege of being able to just succeed no matter what. And now that that's declining across the board, you're not as optimistic. Where are we going?
This is just a super uplifting.
Well, I wanted to go then maybe to this one here. All right. So speaking of uplifting,
Jesus.
So this is a global trends report from 2023, because I was curious, like, even though this is the voices of Gen Z and perspectives, it's primarily related to mental health, grades, education. They don't talk much about global trends more broadly, such as climate change, which I feel like is something that most young people are relatively familiar with. Like when we think about youth organizing, a huge portion of it globally is focused on environmental climate change and counteracting that. This is a report focused on markets. So keep in mind, this is an economic facing report. First off, they describe this as a polycrisis. It's a word I've never heard before, but I
like that.
I get it. A polycrisis is not just a situation where you face multiple crises. It is a situation where the whole is even more dangerous than the sum of its parts. That sounds about right. Talking to kids, this is something that came up time and time again, is this feeling of being overwhelmed because so many things were wrong. And it's difficult to consider changing it because systems are so complex. It says that 31% of people are optimistic about the world in 2023, but individually, 58% of people say that they're happy and 59% are optimistic about their own futures. From a societal level, people aren't thinking that we're going to do well, but personally, they might do okay. Then also the growing amounts of disinformation. So here's a chart from across the world about the percent at which people agree or disagree with this statement. Even the scientists don't really know what they are talking about on environmental issues. And a shockingly high amount. So the yellow bar here on the far right is 2022, right? You could see that across the board, everyone's really going up. China was already pretty high on that statement, which is interesting because China has been investing a lot into environmental science. But maybe there was like this weird peak in 2016, which I wonder why in the US. But I mean, 50% of people roughly across the Western world, as well as Australia, and 74% of China believes that basically scientists don't understand climate change or don't know what they're talking about.
That is at odds with our lived experience of the last several years of climate change. I know from my experience here in Iowa, I did not know what the word derecho meant until one smashed my house to pieces. So I had to get a new roof and all new siding because a inland hurricane It hit the place where I was living in the middle of Iowa, and that had never happened before.
But I mean, there's certainly a divide based off of political identity as well, right? As those
Yeah.
problems have gotten worse, the less people from certain political groups are willing to acknowledge it or perhaps even go against it, right? I remember
Yeah.
10, 20 years ago, conservatives, for the most part, believed in businesses addressing climate change. But nowadays, it's that climate change doesn't exist. So it makes sense to me that you would see climate skepticism rising in a time where the forces at bay are propagandizing and saying that
Yeah.
you should be more skeptical.
God, especially for Australia. I mean, a nation that has been perpetually on fire as a result of climate change.
To bring this all back to this Voices of Gen Z report, I think it's important to note 2 points. The first is that there's a huge difference between being optimistic about the future and actually living your future, right? We know that people are not getting jobs in the degrees that they're pursuing. We know that people who are out exploring the world and are attempting to get things done are struggling to get those things done, both in terms of their ability to buy a house, their ability to have enough money to survive, their ability to afford healthcare, climate change impacting their daily lives. Like, people are not doing well in comparison to generations past on these same exact metrics, but yet people remain optimistic. So that first point is that Americans have always been optimistic. Our obsession with individuality makes us more likely than other groups of people to be optimistic because we think that we personally can change that. We talked about this on our solar punk video, that perhaps part of the reason why Marvel movies are so popular is that it's an example of an individual who they themselves can change the world. And it gives you the opportunity to be optimistic that, hey, someone's going to come around and save us and everything's going to be okay.
Right.
That is the result of living in a very neoliberal society that tells you that time and time again, that you can just pick yourself up by the bootstraps, you can make a difference. No one's going to tell you otherwise. And that's the end of the conversation, which makes us ignore those structural problems that we face, broadly. In addition to this optimism, it has to be placed in the context of 50% of the world's population is ignoring the problems that exist entirely. So certainly we can be optimistic about the future if we don't believe that the problems exist. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
If 50% of the world's population believes that climate change doesn't exist.
I feel like we got to end on something different here. The one generation that we cannot claim at all to understand.
Well, I mean, if you're teaching elementary or middle school, you already understand this, but high school, this is coming.
All right, thanks for watching. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and let Chris know in the comments how much you want to see the return of Cool Nick or the expansion of the Nickverse. And don't forget Puppet Chris, too. We want to see more of the character.